If any of you are like me, then you've become somebody's reptile person. And what I mean by that is everyone has a guy. I have a suit guy, a ride guy, or whatever it is. There goes the cat. But what that really means is that you are the person in wherever you live in your group of social network, you're the reptile person, which means you've probably been asked, hey, what's the first reptile I should get? Or, we're thinking about getting our kid a reptile. Or, what do you think the best choice is for the first beginner pet? And really, there's 3 options you can have. And that's a snake, a turtle, or a lizard. And to be completely honest with you, I don't think any kind of turtle or tortoise is a good first-time pet. And I'll do a whole video about that a little while later. But, so really we're thinking about a snake or a lizard. So, first 2 beginner pets. There's a whole lot of variety when it comes to them, but when we're first thinking about a beginner pet, and that's what this is going to be about, which is the best beginner pet reptile, we're thinking about, if it's a lizard, something like a crested gecko or this leopard gecko, or if it's a snake, something like a corn snake, like Sierra here, or a ball python. So I'm going to go kind of over the pros and cons of both, and it's kind of honestly 100% up to you. They both make great pet animals in general, but I'm going to go over kind of the pros and cons of both. Again, this is just beginner first time things, so there's a whole slew of how intricate and detailed, depending on the species, whatever it is you want to get into, but this is just beginner first-time pet reptiles. So, pros and cons of both, and then I will let whoever it is, because it's entirely subjective, decide what the better one is. And so, first things first, and which is basically, what are you comfortable with? So, obviously, snakes have this really bad stigma because they're snakes. They don't have legs. There's all this other stuff. We did a whole video about that in general. But, whatever it is, that's the biggest one, the kind of deciding factor, what you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable with either, then we can kind of get into it a little bit from there. So we'll first talk about lizards, because that's what I pulled out first. So this is our leopard gecko. She is our rescue. She has MBD, which is metabolic bone disease, and we will talk a little bit about that in just a second. But she is our long-term, forever resident leopard gecko. This is a great beginner reptile. So once again, honestly, I don't know if there is an absolute best particular species of either a snake or a lizard, but I think a leopard gecko or a crested gecko make the perfect beginner ones. And personally, it might be the crested gecko in my personal opinion. I'll talk about that in just a second. So, pros to these guys. So once again, we're talking leopard gecko, crested gecko, maybe African fato gecko or something like that. Something easy, nothing that doesn't take too much down the road. So, pro, they're pretty personable. And what about that I mean, there's this whole thing with anthropomorphization where you attribute animals with human characteristics, which is kind of a slippery slope, and that's a whole other subject too. But they have eyes, they have cute little adorable little faces, little puppy dog faces, and they can be a little bit more personable. You can kind of reflect that in general. And if this is a first-time pet, you're first getting into reptiles, it's your child's first reptile pet, that might be something that's a little bit more attractive to you versus a snake or something like that. They have eyelids, for instance. These guys will still sit there and lick their eyelids, but they can close their eyes. Snakes can't. Another thing about that is that they, for the most part, are fairly active. And while, yes, in general, they can be fairly sedentary, it's a little bit more interesting to watch these guys move around. Once again, if you're not comfortable without legs and things like that, is that they can move around their enclosure. So if it's a crested gecko, it's an upright arboreal setup, and you'll see them stick on the walls and the glass and move around and lick up their food and get up to all sorts of hijinks. And with these guys, you can see them kind of pop their heads out of their enclosures and cruise around and climb on rocks and hunt for their little crickets and things like that, which can be very interesting. And it's a little bit of an easier thing, like if you want kind of like a ride-along little pet. Not that I necessarily recommend that you just kind of hang out and chill with your leopard gecko or crested gecko, because crested geckos have a tendency to just kind of fly off of people, and these guys, obviously not her as much because she honestly can't move as well as a lot of others can, but they will kind of wander off as well. But they are kind of a fun sit on your shoulder little pet. So when I talked a little bit about the feeding part, so these guys chase crickets and stuff, that can be a big pro if you don't want to feed rodents, or in some cases garter snakes, fish and stuff, to your animals. So with a leopard gecko, you feed them bugs. And what that basically means is small dubia roaches, crickets, mealworms, superworms. Never just one kind, but you don't have to deal with rodents. You don't ever have to buy them frozen or live, whatever the case may be. You don't have to deal with that. You don't have to watch it, which can be uncomfortable for a lot of people, and I entirely understand that. I don't necessarily always feel comfortable, especially when feeding live, when it's a necessity, at least for me. I don't really like that. I think it's cool to watch snakes eat and how they do it, but I don't really want to actually see it. I guess I should say I think it's cool how they do it. I don't necessarily want to see it because it was another living animal, and I like the little fuzzy critters too. So you don't have to feed that. You just have to feed bugs. And in the case of a crested gecko, you don't even have to do that. It's literally a powdered mix that you add water to that you can just change out on a dish every day. It doesn't get easier than that. Feeding your cat is more difficult than that. It literally is just scoop, water, mix, there you go. That's it. It's all you have to do. It's absolutely easy peasy. These guys, once again, talking about these specific kinds, they don't get very big, so you don't need a whole lot of real estate in your house to take it up. Something like one of these guys, a 20 gallon, same with the fat tail. So that's, I think, the 20 gallons are 20 inches long, so not even a full 2 feet. Easy peasy. Same with the crested geckos, only upright. So, 12 to 18 inches across, and then, 18 to 24 inches high. Not a whole lot of real estate. It can be kept up on a bookshelf in a bedroom or in the corner of a living room or somewhere. Doesn't take up a whole lot of space. So, basically, that's kind of the pros for having a lizard like this. Now let's talk about the cons. The con is, well, bugs, like we said. Well, yes, you don't have to feed mice. A lot of people have quite the aversion to bugs in general, especially cockroaches, which is unfortunate because dubia roaches and similar species are some of the best insects you can feed to an insectivore animal like this leopard gecko or a fat-tailed gecko. So that can be a con. Not to mention, they have to be given proper nutritional supplements. And so what I mean by that is that a lot of time, if you ever go to your reptile store and you say, I would like 20 crickets for my bearded dragon, please, they'll say, do you want those dusted or undusted? And what that means is that they have a little calcium dust powder, and I wish I had it in my hand right here, but a little calcium powder that they will put on their crickets because they don't necessarily get 100% of the vitamins and calcium and everything they need in captivity, so we add these supplemental things to their diet so that way they stay healthy. And if you don't do that, then they can develop issues. So for instance, the MBD that I talked about, the metabolic bone disease. What happens is they don't get enough calcium in their diets, and then their bones actually become somewhat pliable, and it's an irreversible effect. It literally can never go away. Their lives can improve, and if you saw her when she came in with her two other tank mates that were in considerably worse condition than her, they looked horrible. They weren't kept at the right temps. They weren't given the right humidity. They were only given crickets, if that. They weren't given the correct supplements, because there's also vitamins too that they need as well. So that's kind of a con too. Not only you have to vary their diet with bugs on a more regular basis, every day to every other day, depending on what you're feeding or how big they are, as well as you have to make sure they get their calcium and vitamin supplements. It's really not that difficult, but it's a whole extra step or two that you have to deal with that you wouldn't have to when you're feeding a snake. So there's that. The next one is their setups. Depending on how intricate you want to get their setups, we're talking about startup cost here. That's probably how I should have said this. Their startup cost. Startup cost for a lizard is usually, not always, a little bit more expensive than a snake, regardless of what species it is. The reason for that is they usually need a little bit different sort of lighting. Leopards, fat tails, crested geckos don't necessarily need UVB light, but once you start to get to a bearded dragon, which is a little bit more like manageable, handleable reptile, they need UVB light, they need more room, they need different substrates, they need water dishes, they need food dishes, they need a lot of different things to climb on and interact with, that it in general can sometimes cost a little bit more. And especially in the case where a lot of people want to get right into bearded dragons, and I don't necessarily think they're the best beginner reptile, then you have to have UVB light. You need to have a higher basking spot. You need to have an area for them to cool off. All that requires a bigger enclosure, so it costs more in general. So startup costs for lizards, usually, okay, we'll put you back because we're going to switch over to the snakes here in just a sec. They're usually a little bit more expensive. So those are kind of the pros and the cons to the lizards, And so now we'll talk a little bit about snakes. So everyone kind of has their opinions about what snakes is the best. And like I said, I don't think there's necessarily one really good one. But let's be honest, if you're getting a first-time pet and it's a snake, it's either probably going to be a corn snake or a milk snake or something similar, or a ball python. We won't talk I'll talk a little bit about that. We won't go too much about kind of the controversy about the ball pythons as a beginner pet. So, cons right off the start, the whole snake thing. But we'll get to that in a second. We'll start with the pros. These guys can be kept very simply. That doesn't necessarily mean that they should be kept on just a paper towel with a water dish, just like with the leopard geckos and the crested geckos. They need more than that to have enriching, fulfilling lives, but they can be kept a little bit more simple. Most snakes need underheat versus basking heat, depending on the type of snake and the enclosure that you have. Those are usually a little bit less. You don't have to worry about changing bulbs and stuff that you have to do with a reptile if you have a very nice large undermat heat. The feeding for these guys, well, yes, it is mice. They don't eat nearly as often. With a lizard, you have to be feeding them every day, every other day. Depending on the snake, you're feeding them once a week to once a month. And that's just fine. Like, for instance, a ball python, it's not necessarily the most recommended thing, but you could feed a ball python once a month from birth to death, and it will be perfectly fine. And that's something you don't have to deal with. If they're eating frozen thaw, like most snakes take fairly readily, you can buy a pack from any reptile store or online vendor and keep it in your freezer, and you just defrost one once a week, and that's all you have to do. Another bright side is if they only eat once a week, they usually only poop once a week, which can be kind of nice for cleanup. And then when it comes to the snakes, there is a big reason why ball pythons are so popular, and that is the colors and morphs. While leopard geckos and crested geckos have a huge variety of morphs and colors, all sorts of crazy things, let's be honest, they pale in comparison to the literal hundreds of morphs and combinations and patterns that ball pythons and to a lesser degree corn snakes can have. They come in such a crazy variety of colors, it's hard to find just a normal ball python or corn snake. Take, for instance, Sierra here. She is an aneurystic or anery corn snake. That means that this is a recessive trait, and it doesn't contain the aneurysphores, which make the red and brown pigment, so she's this gray and black snake. So that is something that a lot of people find very interesting, and myself included. Let's be honest, I have a real bias for snakes over lizards, so I'll usually end up suggesting that, but I'm trying to do my best to stay neutral in this. So those are kind of the pros to a snake, as well as the fact that they're honestly more of a just kind of hang out and sit with you, specifically an adult corn snake or a ball python. They call them pet rocks for a reason. Well, yes, they're obviously not a pet rock. They are alive. They are living, breathing, thinking, feeling animals, but they do just kind of sit there. They're very sedentary compared to any kind of lizard. Even corn snakes, too. What are you doing, you weirdo? So, if you just want a snake to you want to sit there and, watch some YouTube videos, wink, wink, and hang out with a reptile, these are honestly probably a more just kind of don't have to sit there and pay attention to them animal versus the other ones that you're going to have to actively be watching to making sure they're not getting into things. Now let's talk about the cons really quick. So as we said before, no legs. It's very off-putting, especially in a lot of Western cultures. And they all think they're venomous or they say poisonous. I'm not going to touch on that one. There's that. The other one is all snakes are carnivorous. Some reptiles are herbivorous or omnivorous. So, for instance, the bearded dragons, you can feed them greens in addition to the insects. Iguanas, uromastyx, once they, specifically uromastyx, but iguanas, once they achieve adulthood, they're almost exclusively vegetarians. You can feed them a salad mix. Not just lettuce, but greens. And then you don't have to deal with bugs or rodents or anything like that, which is kind of nice sometimes. But if you have a snake, you're going to be feeding it some sort of animal protein, be it birds, rats, amphibians, lizards, fish, whatever the species requires, you're going to be feeding it another animal. That's the circle of life. We watch The Lion King, we know how it works. That's the deal with these guys, which can be very interesting. Like I said before, I love snakes, but I love the fuzzy critters too. So it's kind of this weird mix. The other one is that their food in general costs more. Maybe if we sat there and like totaled the amount that you have to spend on all the different bugs and calcium and vitamin supplements versus buying like surplus packs of or bulk packs of frozen rodents, then it might offset a little bit. But for the most part, the mice and things are a little bit more expensive. If you're going to your local pet store or even your big chain brick and mortar store which I would not recommend, and you're buying one mouse or one rat a week, depending on what it is, you're spending between $1 and $5 a week, which isn't a whole lot, but compared to $1 for 3 days worth of crickets, it starts to add up. So, in general, it's a little bit more costly to feed these guys. But the startup cost, other than the cost of the animal itself, is usually a little bit more inexpensive, especially when you're not dealing with a ball python, when you're dealing with like a New World North American clubber, like a cornstick or milk snake. They don't need as high humidity. They can be kept in an aquarium as long as it's tightly sealed and locked so they can't escape. Then your costs are usually a little bit less. So, to sum it all up, lizard, snake, they both can be great, amazing pets, great first-time beginner pets. Just you have to remember what you're comfortable with. You have to think in the startup costs. They both can be fairly inexpensive, but in the end, it does start to add a lot, and startup cost does cost quite a bit. But in all honesty, so does startup costs for a lot of other animals. When you're getting a dog, you have to buy the leash, the water, the vaccinations, the toys, the crate, all those things, they all add up too. So startup cost of whatever animal you decide to take responsibility for is going to cost a fair amount, and that's okay. And then once after that, you have to remember, okay, am I okay feeding mice? Not nearly as often. Am I okay feeding animals? Or am I okay feeding bugs? Which is a little bit more comfortable for me. Do I want an animal that I can sit there and interact with and relate a little bit more and think it's cute and all these fun little faces, which is definitely more of a pet thing? Or do you want an animal that you can just kind of observe more naturally? You can still say it's cute, but just kind of enjoy their more movements and behavior versus just kind of the cute of versus the snake versus the lizard. All of those things. Basically, the whole thing it is subjective to you. And regardless of which one it is, please make sure you do your research. You would absolutely not, if you want a dog and you bring home a Mastiff, think you're bringing home a Chihuahua, it's a huge difference and you don't quite know what you're getting up to. Just like dogs and cats, all the different breeds are a little bit different. They require different things. Same with snakes and with lizards in general. So with ball pythons, most people always forget that they need very high humidity and it's hard to achieve that sometimes. So more research needs to be done with that. Still make great pets, but research needs to be done for that. Leopard geckos. Everyone thinks that they're 100% desert. You can keep them on sand, keep them under that red basking bulb. Well, that's not entirely the case. They need humidity. They need humid hides, even access to fresh water all the time, because they do need humidity. Otherwise, they will have shedding problems and things like that. So and I'm not trying to ward anyone away from one or the other or reptiles in general. Clearly, I love them and think they're amazing. But just remember that a little bit of forethought, some responsibility and ownership of whatever living, breathing animal you choose to add to your life to make your life better and to give them a great life as well. That's all we're asking for in general. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know down in the comments, and we'll check you next time.